The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Apologies for the extremely late start of today's webinar. I understand that you've all been inconvenienced waiting for me, and I do apologize for that. I do have a legitimate excuse. There is a bug in Citrix software which forced me to install a Java update before I could start the webinar. The Java update crashed twice, requiring 2 reboots of my computer, and finally did succeed, and now I am here. So again, apologies for the late start. But on behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to our webinar on dimensions of test coverage. I am Rest Black. I am the president of RBCS. We're a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Maybe Citrix needs to hire us to test their software. Since 1994, RBCS has delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. We have a team of international consultants that deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 11 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process, 4 books on the ISTQB program, and the new ebooks Testing Metrics, Improving the Testing Process, and Improving the Software Process. We are presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. Check out their website, softwaretestpro.com. Also, you might be interested in catching me in April at their conference, the STP conference. Go to stpcon.com for more info. Today's webinar earns you PMI PDUs if you need them and like them. Thank you to Murali Guthula for reviewing the materials for PDU status and for making valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. RBCS's provider ID is 2986. Before we start the presentation, a couple housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, submit them throughout the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note that I answer those only at the end. I'm sure there's a million questions already in there about when is this going to start. I will maybe redirect all those to the Citrix Help Desk. There's no need to ask for presentation copies, as the presentation is on the web at www.rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the Resources page, Resources tab, upper middle, go to the Basic Library, and you will find the slides there in PDF format. Also, by attending this webinar, you are automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple of days and watch that spam filter. You might be a lucky winner. If you are having problems with the audio or visual components of this webinar, please contact GoToWebinar support. Problems are usually related to browser incompatibility, in which case you wouldn't be here at all, probably, if you hadn't figured that out. Company firewalls, which would also prevent you from getting in, and audio settings on your PC. So those are the good starting places for debugging the problem. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. So today's presentation is on dimensions of test coverage, what has and has not been tested. So, pardon me. Today we're going to try to answer some questions about what test coverage means, what is it, how is it perceived by non-testing stakeholders when they hear discussions about test coverage. What do they think we mean by that? How to draw a sharp distinction between test coverage and test execution status. Test coverage reporting should be part of test execution status, but just saying what percentage of the tests have been executed does not constitute reporting test coverage. This is a source of a lot of confusion. In fact, I had a very interesting discussion on Twitter. At least it was interesting until some ad hominem attacks on various people involved in the discussion started and then the discussion ended. But up until that point, there was a very interesting discussion going between Michael Bolton and Keith Klain and Ben Simo and myself about what coverage is about and what it does or doesn't mean. So this is an area where there's a lot of confusion, a lot of differences of opinions and such. So this webinar is in part a way to try to help us get a better understanding of what we can and can't measure with coverage and how that can help us report our results. So there are 4 fairly typical missions or objectives for testing in organizations: finding bugs, reducing risk, providing information, and building confidence in the testing and in the product. And coverage reporting relates to the 4th of those goals, that goal of building coverage, building confidence in the testing and in the product itself. So if we have covered with our testing what we said we were going to cover, in other words, what our test basis is, what we said we set out to evaluate, then that should make people feel that we have done sufficient testing. So in our test plan, whether that's a written document or just a statement that we've made to people, we should say, this is what's in scope and this is what's out of scope. This is what we intend to test. And then in our testing, we should be measuring that we have indeed tested that in some way or another. And that's what we're talking about with respect to measuring test coverage. Now, if the test results say that the product is working, if we're getting positive results for what we have covered, then not only should test coverage allow us to have confidence that the testing was sufficient, but also it should give us confidence that the system is ready for deployment, is ready for release. Now, of course, the opposite possibility is something that can occur as well, which is that the test results do indeed demonstrate sufficiency of testing, but they also demonstrate that the quality of the product is low, and in that case, then testing would build, or coverage metrics would build confidence in the testing, but it would actually undermine confidence. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is it would prevent false confidence in the product as a shippable thing. So what we're going to do is look at ways of using metrics to measure how well we've achieved our coverage goals. How thoroughly have we tested? And we'll look at a number of those here, some common and some not so common. The most common of the dimensions of test coverage metrics is specification coverage, usually requirements coverage. Most major test management tools include the ability to measure the coverage of the requirements, and that's something that's very commonly done. Also fairly common is risk coverage, looking at the product or quality risks that have been covered by testing. Generally speaking, you can put those into the same bucket, if you will, in the test management tool, and measure coverage of those in the same way that you are measuring coverage of the requirement specifications. Now, you also have the ability to measure whitebox or code coverage. It's commonly done with various code coverage tools, perhaps more common at the unit level than, say, at the system or acceptance level, though sometimes it is done. We'll look at that a little bit further. Coverage of the configurations that we supported or want to support is another thing that's fairly commonly measured. And then in the less common category, you have the coverage of different types of data, coverage of user personas, and also coverage of defect taxonomy. So these are all the common and uncommon metrics of test coverage that we're going to look at here over the next few minutes. Okay, so specification coverage. In a requirement specification or a design specification, we often will have defined behaviors or structures in the system. Requirements would typically be about behaviors, and design specifications about structures. And what we're going to want to do is look at how thoroughly those have been tested. Excuse me. So what we're going to do is put those specification elements, use cases, user stories, screens, fields, design elements, what have you, into some kind of spreadsheet, or better yet, a table in a database, which might or might not be part of a commercial or open source test management tool. And we associate via traceability test cases back to those specification elements. And then as we run the tests, we can keep track of which of those elements have been completely tested, and for those that have been completely tested, which of the elements are known to work. In other words, the test status is all positive. Now, what this will do for us is allow us to spot holes in our test coverage. In other words, things that we needed to test behaviorally or structurally that we have not tested. So if the tests are missing, or if the tests have not yet been executed, then we can see that. And that gets to the question of whether we should have confidence in the thoroughness of our testing. Now, if the testing is thorough, in other words, every specification element has been covered, but some of those are not working, known failures, then that tells us, hey, this is where we have specific problems with the software. Now, as I said before, on the contrary, if the results are all positive, then we can say, we do have confidence in the software. It's because we have tested it to the extent that we said we were going to test it, and it works. Now, this all sounds very good, but one of the things to keep in mind is that according to Capers-Jones's studies, about 20% of defects are introduced in requirement specifications and another 25% in design. So basically 45% of the defects are in the specifications, which means that if all you do is measure with, in terms of specification coverage, you're measuring with a flawed ruler. The defects that exist in the specification, especially gaps, can create a real level of false confidence here that people look to go, oh yeah, look, we've thoroughly tested everything, but in reality, the holes in the requirement specification can turn into holes in the testing, which then means that we're unaware of the gap in our testing. We go live with software in which we have confidence, but it turns out to be false confidence in the software. So while specification coverage is a good and useful metric, when used by itself, it is weak and unbalanced. Here's an example of specification coverage for one of our clients. We put together a testing dashboard, and they included a coverage breakdown. Now these A, B, C, D, E, and F are all major subsystems within the system. I don't know if you can imagine a system that included 6 major components or subsystems. This would be broken down this way. And what we have is, for each component, two data sets that we're graphing. The green and red data set on the left-hand side for each subsystem is the test breakdown. So what we have is the tests are traceable back to the requirement specifications, and the requirement specifications are grouped by major subsystem. And what we were able to do is look at the percentage of tests that have been run total, broken down by failed and passed. Excuse me. So you can see for subsystem A, We've run about 55% of the tests, and about 10% of the tests have failed, and 45% have passed. For subsystem B, on the other hand, we've only run 15% of the tests, and they've all failed. We also have, on the right-hand side, a breakdown of the total number of defects filed against each subsystem, percentage of defects basically filed against each subsystem as a percentage of the total number of defects. And those are also broken down by closed, meaning it's resolved in some sense or other, passed, closed out or deferred or rejected as not actually a problem, versus the active defects, which is where there's still work remaining to be done. And you can see here that subsystem B accounts for most of the reported defects, about 35%. While subsystem C accounts for the least number of defects, only 5%, and of those, all of them are closed. So, a way to use this chart is we can look at which subsystems are doing well and which ones are doing poorly. So, for example, the champion here, obviously, from a quality point of view, is F, is a fairly insignificant source of defects. A little over 10% of the total number of defects reported were reported against subsystem F. And there are just a few that remain active, 2%, maybe 3%, and all the tests have been run, and 95% of the tests have passed. So we're in very good shape with F. D is likewise also in pretty good shape. There are some known problems. 20% of the tests fail, and there's about 5% of the active defects are against D, but the testing is complete. So this is looking very solid. In stark contrast to B, which is clearly the problem child here. 15% of the tests run, all of them failed. 30% of the defects total reported in active state against B. 35% of the defects total have been reported against D or B. So, it's in very bad shape. And then sort of in the middle here, we have, I guess, the next worst one, I guess, would be E here. Significant percentage of the tests have failed, and there's a lot of active defects. A is in somewhat better shape, and that more than half of the tests have been run. A significant percentage failed, but fewer active defects percentage-wise than really any of the others except for C and F. And then C is kind of in the middle state here in the sense of, so far it looks good, but we also have a fair amount of testing left to be done. So this gives us a sense of where we can have confidence in the testing and the system, and where we should not. But of course, again, by itself, this graph leaves open the question of, well, what about problems in the requirements specifications, and if these are also included the design specifications, how do we deal with that? And the answer is this chart by itself can't, because it's all done in reference to the specifications. And this, by the way, when people criticize coverage and coverage metrics, I think what happens is they get fixated on requirements coverage, and they think of the problems that they've had with requirements coverage, and the weaknesses that it is displayed, and they don't think about the fact that you can repair those weaknesses by addressing some other areas. So let's now look at some of those other dimensions of test coverage that we can use to kind of fill these gaps. One of them, which is very important, is risk coverage. So if you're doing risk-based testing, and I've gone on and on this forum and others about how to do risk-based testing, and we have webinars, recorded webinars on the website, as well as some videos on the digital library on the website. to get a better sense of what risk-based testing is. But if you do risk-based testing, you will identify risks to the quality of the system, or quality risks. And then we can, again, use traceability, as we did with the requirement specifications, to trace the tests back to the risks, and thus trace the test results back to the risks. And this allows us to have a very solid sense of what is still at risk and what is not from a quality point of view. Because we're going to be able to say, okay, these are the risks that have been fully mitigated through testing. These are the risks that have been partially mitigated, but there are known problems with them. And then these are the risks that have not yet been mitigated because there's still testing yet to be done. Now, this does, of course, require that the quality risk analysis be good, because, again, we're tracing back to the risks, and we need to make sure that the risks have been properly identified. If there are gaps in our risk analysis, there will, of course, also be gaps in our coverage, or gaps in our coverage analysis, excuse me. Now, one of the ways that this happens is this holes in the risk analysis, and thus the identified risk, is when organizations do something that they call risk-based testing, but which is actually not, which is where they just simply go through the requirement specifications and assign risk ratings to each requirement specification element. Well, obviously that approach is going to have the exact same holes in it that purely requirements-based testing does, and requirements coverage analysis would also be similarly, risk coverage analysis would be similarly flawed if all of the risks derive solely from an analysis of the requirements. Not to pick on anybody, but this is a process that is identified in Rick Craig's book, Systematic Software Testing, and described as risk-based testing. But it really, it's not risk-based testing. It's risk-augmented requirements-based testing. And what I'm talking about here is actually true risk-based testing, where an independent process is used to identify the risks of the quality of the system. And that, if that is done, then that will offset this issue that I mentioned, the gaps in the requirements coverage. Also, what happens is that if you do both, if you have risk coverage and requirements coverage, they are to some extent complementary. One will fill the holes in the other if they're done properly. Now, this can be done in the same manner as with requirements-based testing. As I said, you just put the risks into your test basis in the test management tool, table somewhere. Now, the thing that is worth mentioning, though, is that if you're using a tool like, for example, Quality Center, you will probably have to customize it. So the folks at the Mercury folks introduced something that they referred to as support for risk-based testing, but unfortunately what happened was that they made it kind of overly intricate, I guess you could say, in my opinion, and it requires some customizing to make it work really well. But it does work, and it can be made to work through customization. Now, let me give you an example of reporting risk coverage here. Some of you who are frequent listeners to this webcast probably heard this before, seen this before, but bear with me. What we can do is we can take each risk that we've identified and classify it into one of three categories. Green is the risks where all the tests associated with that risk have been run and they all pass, and there are no known must-fix defects that are still active. Red is for the risks that some of the tests have been run, maybe all of the tests have been run, and at least one of those tests is still marked as failed, and or at least one must-fix defect is still active. And then black is the other the other risks, those are risks where there aren't any known must-fix bugs or failed tests, but we're still tests left to be run, so we can't classify it as green yet. Now, what happens here at the beginning of your test execution period is all the risks are in the black category because you haven't run any tests. And then as you run tests, what's typically going to happen if you're doing proper risk-based testing is that the red regions should start to grow disproportionately fast because you run the tests that you think are likely to fail early. And then what will happen is you get towards the middle of the test execution period, your red region will kind of have been maximized. The green region will start to grow disproportionately fast. And then when you get to the end of the test execution period, you should see roughly what's the shape that's shown on the right, which is where you've got a most, and probably not quite all, but almost all of the tests have passed, and you've got a few risks that are still in the black and red category. And notice that you can report to people on which risks are in the black and the red categories, and the organization can make a decision about whether to continue testing or not. So in other words, reporting of the red and the black risks is effectively a reporting of what the residual risk is. So those are very common and useful coverage metrics, but there are others, and we should be aware of those others as well. Certainly Whitebox coverage, typically referring to code coverage, or sometimes data flow coverage, is something that's out there. There are different code coverage metrics that are floating around, and there's a certain amount of confusion that exists about those. If you are interested, I did a webinar a while ago on Whitebox coverage metrics and what they mean, so you could tune into the recorded webinar, or if you've got somebody in your team who needs to have a better understanding of Whitebox coverage metrics, then have them tune into it, because people do tend to be pretty confused about those different metrics, because there are many of them. Now, very useful Whitebox coverage metrics are, especially for programmers in doing their unit testing. Also can be used, sometimes used system test phases, system integration test phases, to try to see if there's any areas of the code that we're missing. Now, the important thing, there's a couple important things to mention here. One is that when you're doing black box test design, in other words, test design based on things like risks and requirement specifications and other behavioral elements, typically you're not going to cover most of the code. It's kind of a surprise to people, but a good general rule is that your white box coverage for a set of tests that are designed based on behavior is going to be under 50% of the code will actually be tested. It's generally not a good idea at system test or system integration test to make 100% code coverage on any code coverage metric a goal, but rather to look at what you don't cover and determine whether that indicates a problem, and make a case-by-case determination of what needs to be added to your testing based on gaps in coverage. But don't just say, oh, we should always try to test 100% of the code in system test, because A, that might turn out to be impossible, and B, even if it were possible, it would probably be of limited value. But certainly for programmers doing unit testing, you would like the programmers to achieve 100% code coverage on one of the metrics, and I believe it's branch coverage, which we'll look at in a minute. But it is important to understand that even if programmers do that, defect detection effectiveness for unit testing, even very good unit testing, tops out at around 50% according to industry studies. So, there are certainly many different kinds of problems that you will not be able to find in unit testing, even with very thorough code coverage. So it's important not to develop a false sense of confidence in the unit testing based on achieving a high degree of white box test coverage. Another thing to keep in mind about white box coverage is you can only cover the code that's there. You can't cover code that should be there but isn't. So missing functionality, for example, exception handlers that should exist but don't, those kinds of things. Those you cannot reveal those kinds of problems by focusing on achieving a high level of white box code coverage. Now, you will need tools to do this. There are code instrumentation tools of various types, unit testing tools of various types, which will do this for you. It's important to keep in mind that if you do decide to do a white box code coverage measurement of your system tests or system integration tests, that you will be testing against an instrumented version of the code, and that it will behave in some ways differently than a non-instrumented version of the code would. That's referred to sometimes as the probe effect. So generally speaking, while you might want to maybe one cycle of your system testing do a test of or check of your code coverage, it's not a good idea to do all of your testing against a white box or excuse me, an instrumented version of the code. Because the behaviors will differ, and I've seen instances of this where it's not just performance and reliability behavior, though that's definitely the primary thing affected by the instrumentation, but it can also be functional behavior can change due to timing issues, and that clearly is a potential problem. You can get both false positives and false negatives out of these situations. Okay, as I said, I've got a very detailed webinar that discusses the different white box coverage metrics that I would encourage you to listen to if you need more information on this. But basically, there are a number of metrics that are used. The most common one that you run into is what's called statement coverage, or sometimes confusingly referred to as code coverage. That statement coverage is what percentage of the executable statements have been executed one or more times during testing. Certainly we would want in unit testing that be 100%, because otherwise there is code that has been written that has never been executed by the developer, which Boris Beiser made an interesting comment once in one of his books, Systematic Software Testing, I think, or Software Test Techniques, where he said that should actually be criminal to write code and not to actually execute it at least once. And who am I to argue with good Dr. Beiser? Decision coverage is, if you look at the branching statements, the ifs and the switch cases and the loops, well, where there's two different paths in the code based on a decision that's being made, true or false, or in the switch case, it's of course multiple possible targets for that. The decision coverage would be the percentage of those possible branches or decision outcomes that have been taken. And this is what I would like to see as sort of a universal standard for unit testing personally, is that not only should 100% statement coverage be achieved, but 100% decision coverage should be achieved, because otherwise you have major decision points in the code that are not being exercised, and it's hard to argue that that's okay. Most of the white box coverage tools that you will run across will be able to report both statement and decision coverage. Condition coverage, it has to do with the atomic conditions that have been exercised, the individual conditions that drive the decisions. In the case of simple conditions, where it's like if A greater than B, do this, then condition coverage and decision coverage are the same. For complex conditions, where it's something like if A greater than B and C greater than D, then do this, and condition coverage has to do with basically each of those conditions, A greater than B and C greater than D, has to have been at least once true and once false. That's not a very typical metric. but it is part of what's called Modified Condition Decision Coverage, or MCDC coverage, which the simplest way to describe this is it's the percentage of atomic conditions that have been able to determine the outcome once to be true and once to be false. Basically, it's making sure that in any way that the conditions can matter, they have been tested both true and false in all combinations that matter for that particular condition. Multiple condition coverage is an even higher level of coverage, which is all possible combinations. That's pretty unusual. Modified condition decision coverage, or MCDC coverage, is actually in wide use. It's used in the aerospace industry because for safety critical software that runs on planes, it has to be 100% MCDC coverage. Another thing that you will sometimes run into is what's called basis path coverage if you're using the McCabe cyclomatic complexity metrics as part of testing, and basis path coverage is basically equivalent to decision coverage. So if somebody's saying that a programmer is saying that they've covered 100% of the basis paths, then they have achieved decision coverage as well, 100% decision coverage. Okay, here's something else which is something that people often strive for but don't always measure, which is making sure that they've identified all the supported configurations and tested them. So if you're doing a browser-based application, for example, you want to test with all the different major browsers that are out there and probably the different versions of the browsers, and maybe if you're feeling really particularly paranoid, I guess you could say, or particularly risk-averse, down to specific service pack levels on the browsers. And also, operating system support. Have you tested the different supported operating systems? Security software. Have you tested the different supported security software? For mobile applications, of course, you'd be wanting to look at similar types of things with respect to the different phones, and your coverage of those supported configurations. Now, what you can do with this is, if you've got a test management tool, you simply enter the configurations as if they were the supported configurations, as if they were requirements, and then just trace your testing back to the specific supported configurations that have been tested. And your goal, of course, would be to look at, have we tested 100% of the different supported configurations. Now, in some cases, it makes sense to use a technique like orthogonal arrays or various pairwise testing tools to try to test combinations of configuration options. Personally, I think this is it's one of those fads that has definitely jumped the shark in the sense that it's overused. There are people that are doing pairwise testing that if you were to ask them, why do you need to test pairs as opposed to just making sure that every option has been tested at least once, they would not be able to give you a good answer to that question. So if you're one of those people that is testing pairs, I would invite you to ask yourself that question. Why do you feel it's necessary to test pairs of configuration options rather than just making sure that every configuration option has been tested at least once? If you don't have a good fact-based answer to that question, then I would say don't do it. And somebody told me to do that is not a fact-based answer to that question, by the way. A fact-based answer to that question would be, we have historically seen a significant percentage of field defects that were due to particular combinations of configuration options. That would be a fact-based answer to that question. So, pardon me. Let's see. Another interesting and potentially useful coverage metric to look at is data sets. So if you have a lot of different types of data that are being managed by your application, and they are managed in very different ways, then it would be good to sit down and look at those different types of data and then put those in, again, like you would with a requirement, as separate requirements, and make sure that you are testing all those different types of data. Now, this I think is a good analysis to do. It's a good way of augmenting your specification-based and risk-based coverage analysis. I would point out, though, that it does require a very thorough understanding of the types of data that the application is handling, and that's not always something that the test team has. You might need to pull in some outside expertise, I guess, to make sure that you get that kind of thorough understanding of the data. Because otherwise, anytime you are measuring coverage against a flawed or incomplete standard, in this case, missing major types of data, then that coverage metric has the severe risk of becoming a source of false confidence. You think you're testing more thoroughly than you actually are because you're testing everything that you could think of, but of course the point of coverage analysis is to go beyond testing everything that you could think of to testing everything that actually needs to be tested, which is not necessarily the same as everything that you think of. So just be careful with it. It can be sort of a circular logic that kicks in here, very dangerous circular logic, that you think you understand the test basis and you think you've covered the whole test basis, but what you've actually done is simply defined a metric that reinforces, or that not reinforces, but that masks your ignorance of certain areas that need to be tested, and it can be a very dangerous thing. I'll be the first to admit that I have made this mistake myself as a test manager and paid the price. So, learn from my mistake, and do not have false confidence in your what you're measuring coverage against, but be very careful to make sure that it is as complete as it possibly can be. And of course, always keep in mind a proper sense of humility, right? That all works of human beings are incomplete and imperfect, and so you should always be ready to accept the reality that no matter how good a job you do in terms of defining your test coverage metrics and your test basis that you're measuring the coverage against, it will be holes in it. We cannot test exhaustively. We can't test everything. Now, here's another thing that would be it would be wise to include in your coverage analysis, which is identifying different types of users. So if you have a very disparate user base, which of course you will if you've got an application that runs on a mobile device or a browser, and anybody with internet access can use it, you will have people with wildly different skill sets, backgrounds, ways of interacting with computers, etc., that will be using your applications. And so it'd be a good idea to sit down with some users and or failing that, some people who have expertise in what's sometimes called UX, or user experience, user interface design, usability, and really do some analysis of this and identify these different personas. Especially if you're in a world where it's going to be mass market type of software, and anybody could be using it. If you're building software for internal use, this might be less of an issue because you have sort of a captive audience. But with more and more functionality being opened up to the broader world, then of course this is something that becomes more and more relevant for really everybody. So I think it's something that you should certainly consider. And then finally, another one that's definitely worth considering is defect taxonomy coverage. Very unusual to see this or persona coverage being actually measured, but I think they're very valuable things to do. Go back and look at your past, the past defects that you found, both during testing and also in production, and ask yourself, which tests am I running this time around that would identify these defects if they existed? This is going to be a very good way to prevent a situation where you have a defect that's happened before come up again in production. People hate that, and as I don't think it's fair when people come to the test manager and say, how come you guys didn't find this when a defect is found in production for the first time? I mean, because it's no more fair to do that than, you know, the question that never gets asked, which maybe would be somewhat more fair, would to go to the development manager and say, why did your people put this in here? But certainly, if a defect is found in production a second time, I think that there is some responsibility for us as testers to say, hey, well, you know, we really should know better than to let the same defects escape more than once. We should learn from that. So, you know, I think that's a good practice to do that traceability analysis, see, you know, what are we testing that would address defects that were seen in the past. Now, of course, for first releases, this can be a little difficult to do. You might have to rely on internet information or, you know, some sort of market analysis information you get from a group like, say, I don't know, Gartner or Forrester or something like that, or maybe the MITRE website that has common defects. But the trouble with that is that that's all sort of speculative. You don't actually know what your system is going to do, and so there's some possibility that you'll end up over-testing in these situations because you're testing for stuff that wouldn't actually afflict your system. In terms of how to measure this, you can do this in test management tools. You're probably going to have to do some amount of tweaking unless you're just going to enter these as simple requirements probably in a separate group and indicate, okay, need to test for defect X, need to test for defect Y, etc. Okay, so that brings us to our conclusion here of this somewhat abbreviated ending on the note of defects, appropriately enough, since we started dealing with a defect. We can use coverage metrics to help us understand what we've tested and what we haven't, and to help people outside of the testing organization understand what we've tested and what we haven't. I've mentioned that the importance of having a multidimensional approach to coverage analysis. Don't just rely on one of these dimensions, because any one of these dimensions will necessarily be incomplete. But by balancing 2 or 3 or maybe even all of these dimensions of test coverage, you can really get a good sense of what's been tested and what those test results mean. In terms of a number of different things that we can be interested in terms of defects, in terms of personas, in terms of required behaviors, in terms of risks, etc. I would say that if you're going to start reporting coverage metrics as part of your status reporting, that's great, but make sure that you educate people on how those work. People will take away their own conclusions, I guess you could say, and it's important that those be educated conclusions, that you help influence how those conclusions are reached. And then finally, wherever possible, try to use tools to automate this. These things can be done manually or using crude tools like spreadsheets and so forth, but I'll tell you, trying to do traceability and coverage analysis for, say, 1,000 test cases back to, say, 200 coverage elements that you're looking at. I mean, keep in mind your spreadsheet in that situation is going to have 200,000 active elements. It's very easy to make a mistake and enter some coverage indicator in an adjacent cell, and thus, you know, give yourself create an illusion of covering something that perhaps has not been covered. So tools will help you avoid those kinds of mistakes. All right, so as always, I will put the advertisement up here when we'll get to the Q&A. Let's see. Yeah, we have another number of comments about waiting for the sound to come up. Doug Doug makes a comment. I guess nobody did any testing at Citrix, which is, I wouldn't say that they didn't do any testing, but it's certainly, I think they need to be careful about creating a situation where, you know, a download, an update is forced on somebody, and you know, because they put Oracle's gun to their own head, and when the gun went off, it was the webinar that ended up getting shot. So, you know, I think that's something where you would need to, you know, configuration coverage analysis would be useful for that, but you'd have to take it to that next level and go, okay, I don't only want to test the configuration itself, but I want to test transitions from one version to the next. So you need to look at that kind of carefully. Luis says, there is no audio. Is this expected? Unfortunately, Luis has left. But no, Luis, it was definitely not expected. It was a very unexpected and unpleasant experience. I have some questions from Christy and others asking about the PDU code. You will, as an attendee, receive an email that gives you that PDU code, an attendee email. Those generally go out within 24 to 48 hours. So if you haven't seen it in 2 days, let us know. We did last time around. We were afflicted by a different Citrix bug, which was that some people did not actually get their attendee email. So if in 2 days you have not gotten your attendee email, please get in touch with us, and we will try to fix that problem. So Doug asks, I still don't understand what it means to say a specification element has been covered. All my tests of a requirement can pass, but does that mean I have thoroughly covered the requirement? Okay, excellent point, Doug. So you, you do have to have some way of knowing, have I tested sufficiently for each requirement? Now, in risk-based testing, that is addressed because the extent of testing for a risk is driven by the level of risk associated with the risk. So we say something is a higher risk, we test it more, and we also test it earlier. But yes, it is possible that the tests that have been created for a requirement, or even in some cases a risk, are in some sense inadequate. So there is a reliance on the competence of the testers who developed the tests to address the risks or the requirements or whatever, any of the coverage dimensions that we discussed. There is a reliance on the competence of the testers to develop proper tests for that. And I think this might be another objection that some of the critics of coverage and the whole idea of testing is building confidence are pointing at, which is ultimately, you know, there's no substitute, there's no replacement for the tester involved having skills, and I would certainly agree with that. That the skills of the tester are essential. In the absence of appropriately skilled testers, any of these coverage metrics that one might report is ultimately going to give you false confidence because the testing will not be done competently. Now that situation will of course be revealed post-release when large numbers of defects are found in things that were reputedly tested. Now obviously it's too late at that point to solve the problem with that particular release, but of course we can use that as a learning opportunity for subsequent releases, and you know that gets back to that issue of looking at the defect taxonomies. Not only should we look at it from a point of view of have we tested it, but also I think you have to look at it from the point of view of have we adequately tested it. We have a request here for the PDF. The PDF version of the presentations are always posted within like a week or more before each presentation. They're available for download. You go to rbcs-us.com, go to the Resources tab in the upper middle of the page, and then navigate from there to the basic library, and you'll find the PDF version of the presentation posted there. So if you want to have a printed copy, for example, as Jacqueline asks, as you're going through the presentation, just find it there a few days before you attend, and you get your reminder note from Citrix, which you will get a reminder if you've registered. Just make it a habit to go and print it out, and then you'll have it. Let's see. Sylvia asks, what would be more important / sensitive, product or project risk for systems of systems? I don't know. That's I'm not sure how to answer that question, Sylvia, because that's like which is more important, your left foot or your right foot. I mean, you can't walk properly without having both, and you can't manage a testing effort without addressing both the product risks and the project risks. Sylvia also asks, should white box testing be used on regression tests? Certainly that could be a way of measuring the thoroughness of your regression tests. I think that would be worth looking at. But again, I would caution everybody, don't just set 100% statement coverage or decision coverage as a target for your regression tests at the system level. Obviously, if you're talking about automated unit tests used for regression testing, I believe those should achieve 100% decision coverage. The system or system integration test phases, you have to be more circumspect about your use of coverage analysis, or at least code coverage analysis, to drive your improvements. See, Griffin has a comment here. You want risk to be a separate testable surface than requirements. If by separate testable surface than requirements you mean a independently identified set of things that you test, then yes, I absolutely agree with that, and I think that's maybe a fairly elegant way of putting it. You talk about surface of testing, because it's kind of like a polygon of sorts, where you're looking at these different facets and deciding, okay, I would look through this facet, I look through this facet, what have I tested? Lee comments, so very true about humility with respect to my comment about being, somewhat humble about your metrics and what they mean. And yeah, I'm glad that resonated with you. I think that's very, very important. Well, I mean, one of the things about being a test manager, of course, is ultimately a humbling experience, because you're always dealing with the fact that there's an infinite number of tests that you could run, and out of that infinite number of tests, you are going to select this teeny subset. And so, you're always going to be, your testing is always going to be in some sense, in some very real sense, inadequate to the task. And, I think that's something that you need to make sure that you keep in mind, and that other people understand as well, is that the achieving 100% coverage, even if measured across all of the different dimensions that I've talked about, does not mean we have eliminated the possibility of previously undetected defects. Griffin's got another comment here. All coverage models are wrong, but some are useful. It's a paraphrase of a quote that's attributed either to a statistician named Box or to the quality expert Deming. Whoever said it, it was a wise thing to say. All models are wrong, but some are useful, and I think that's definitely applicable in terms of coverage models, and is maybe another way of saying that what I was just talking about in terms of humility, that you cannot possibly have a complete measure of coverage, because everything is going to be somewhat flawed, but by having different complementary models of coverage measurement, then we can get a much better sense of what's going on. Alex has a question here, a comment, question and comment. It says, lately we've been hearing a lot of clients asking about tools that monitor the test automation scripts run and show what code is being touched during automated test execution, which in turn shows the automated scripts testing coverage at the application code level. Have you seen this working, and is this a relevant metric? What tools would do this kind of monitoring? Well, this gets back to the comment that I have generally about code coverage. I think this is very, very useful if you're talking about automated unit tests. Certainly look at some of the folks that have done a lot of work on automating unit testing. Kent Beck comes to mind. One of the things that he's very interested in is, have we touched all of the code? So yeah, I think for programmers this is exceptionally useful and important. They should not be in the business of delivering untested code to testers and their users. I think for us in the testing world, it really, assuming that this is handled at the programmer test level, the unit test level, then I don't think that it is something that we need to worry about on an ongoing basis. I think it makes sense to periodically measure the code coverage of our system tests and or system integration tests, and then to use the results of that analysis to try to find gaps in our testing that are important to fill. But I would not say we should have some arbitrary standard of code coverage for system test or system integration test. I think that actually is very, very dangerous, as a dangerous misuse of coverage metrics, and it just points to a typical misuse of metrics in general, which is, it goes back to this management cliche, which is what gets measured gets done, which of course has its corollary as what is not measured is not done. So if you define a unidimensional set of coverage metrics, like say just code coverage, that's all you're looking at, and then you say, I'm going to measure the goodness of my testing along this one single dimension, then you're just ignoring so many other things that are important, and unbalancing yourself in that way. And that has to do with test results reporting too. We see the same problem with clients in that area. So I would say, Alex, that there is some value in this, but probably a lot less value than people think they're getting from it, and they're probably actually doing some amount of harm, I would guess. All right, Abby has a question here. What kinds of tools help do this measuring? Well, for the code coverage, it's the code coverage analysis tools. As I said, they have to instrument the code. For the other dimensions of coverage, you can usually use a test management tool. They'll generally have some sort of tab or area where you can enter requirements, and all of those different dimensions of coverage other than code coverage that we've gone through can be modeled as a requirement and entered into that table. Let's see, Griffin has a comment here. Probe effect causes issues on real-time operating systems testing. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And again, just to remind you guys, probe effect was what I was talking about when I was talking about the effect of the instrumentation of the code on the tests and the test results. That's probe effect. I have some questions here about what kind of automated tools I would recommend. I'm not in the business of making uninformed tool recommendations, so in order to make a tool recommendation, I would actually have to come in and look at your specific situation and then tell you, this is what I think your requirements are for a tool, and then from there you can go to evaluating which tools meet those requirements. But just for me to just say use tool X would be really it would be doing you a great disservice to do that. So make sure if you're going to select a test management tool, a code coverage tool, that you sit down and do a very careful analysis of your requirements for the tool before you start selecting them. Is the almost uniformly the beginning of a very sad story when organizations go out and just get a tool, whether free or commercial, without doing a careful evaluation of the requirements first. That would be like taking a phone book and tearing out the pages of the phone book and sticking them on a wall and throwing a dart and then marrying whoever the dart stuck into. It would not be a suitable way of entering into a long-term relationship. So Kanta says, hi, I'm working in an Agile project in that I have a lot of data to test and also data produced due to combinations of a few sets of data. Number of sets will be 10 to 15. Which data set coverage metrics do you suggest? Well, what I would say is, sit down, ideally with somebody who's got a very good understanding of the data that's being managed by the application, and identify what the different data sets are that need to be tested, and the important characteristics or attributes of those data sets from a testing point of view, and then make sure that you have covered all of those. I would be very specific and thorough in this analysis to make sure that your coverage is getting for you what your coverage analysis is doing for you, what you think it's doing for you. Again, be careful with the possibility of doing a superficial analysis in this regard, or in terms of personas for that matter as well, and then going, oh, well, we should have confidence in our system's ability to handle different types of data because we've done this data set coverage analysis. If the analysis is superficial, any confidence that you gain in your testing and your test results will be false confidence. Christy says, thank you for the webinar, and Doug says, another great webinar. Thank you both. Doug goes on, is there any way for a participant to show to their management that they took this webinar? Is the PDU email the only way? Yes, basically you're going to get an attendee email from Citrix, provided it doesn't have the same bug it had last month. You will get an attendee email. It'll be sent to the email under which you registered. So if you, when you registered, if you got a confirmation email of some sort or a reminder email, then you will also receive the PDU email. It's not really a PDU email. It's a thank you for attending email. It happens to have the PDU code in it. So you could forward that to your manager if you want it, or print it. You can do whatever you want. I had another question about tool recommendations. Again, I'm not going to make any blanket tool recommendations. What I will recommend is that you, either on your own or with the assistance of a competent outside unbiased third party, by unbiased read not a tool salesperson, do a analysis of what your requirements are for any tool that you're going to look for, and then go out and go through a very careful selection process. Jyoti asks, where can we find this material? Again, basic library on the RBCS website. Navigate to the resources tab, upper middle of the rbcs-us.com page, and then go from there to the basic library. I had a fellow, oh, I see. That's an email here from somebody. It turns out to be a tool vendor, though. So, defending the goodness of code coverage metrics. Again, I stick with my opinion that while code coverage metrics are very useful at the unit test level, that they can be potentially dangerous if used at the system or system integration test level, especially if they're used on the absence of a more balanced approach. But they can even be dangerous when used as part of a balanced approach if a fetish is made of achieving 100% statement coverage or decision coverage at the system or system integration level. I think that should be attended to by the programmers when they write their code, and that should be adequate. Faisal asks how to imagine all these coverage metrics in an agile methodology such as a Scrum environment where we hardly had time to prepare and present things like that. I think this solution is more valid to classical methodologies such as waterfall or V-model. Please elaborate on this. Thanks. No, I disagree. I think that the way in which you track and present the information might very well be different. But I think that ultimately the goal here of ensuring adequate coverage is completely independent of the methodology that you're following. I mean, to argue that we can be more haphazard and less guided in our testing in an agile environment than in a V model or sequential lifecycle, I would completely disagree with that. In fact, I would say that given the short time spans, the fact that we have very limited time to do our testing, and thus must be sure that every minute of testing time that we have available to us in an agile testing situation is time well spent, that if anything, a detailed understanding of the test basis, that is what we are setting out to cover, and a high degree of confidence that at the end of each iteration we indeed have covered 100% of those things that we said we were going to cover. I think that's just absolutely critical in an agile environment, because there isn't going to be any what I sometimes refer to as accidental test coverage. You're not going to just stumble across stuff because you are going to be so time limited. Pardon me. Griffin's got a comment here. Coverage is a coverage measurement, not a quality measurement. I guess I'd take that to some extent. I mean, I think coverage tells us the extent to which we can have confidence in our testing, and if our test results indicate that the product is in good shape and we have a high degree of confidence in our testing due to our coverage metrics, then I think we can say that by by induction, I think is the logical term for that. By induction, we can have confidence in the quality of the product. But we do have to be careful because, again, all of our coverage metrics are going to be to some extent incomplete. Lee asks, would you recommend this approach for acceptance tests? No, I don't know. I mean, acceptance testing, I think we want to go to the people who are going to be doing the acceptance testing and say, you should have confidence in our system testing is good. That should allow them to feel comfortable to just test certain things that they're particularly interested in, like specific use cases, specific supported environments, and so forth. David asks, is there a resource you'd point to that describes the various or typical questions that release decision makers need to answer that an understanding of coverage measures would benefit? Sure. I mean, I don't know about a resource that I'd point to. I mean, I can answer the question here. I mean, in terms of requirements, I think decision makers are going to justly ask us in testing, well, have all of the specified behaviors been tested at one point or another? In terms of risks, the decision makers can ask, what's the residual level of risk at this point? How much risk am I taking if I go out now? I think for defect taxonomies, what is the possibility that we will have an experience like the experience we had last time when we released and were confronted with certain defects that were unpleasant? Personas, is about we've tested with the different types of users and we feel comfortable that we have adequately tested different user types. We're not going to be surprised by that. So I mean, I think you can look at any of these dimensions and translate that into a way of communicating about testing to the stakeholders, to the decision makers. But it is important that it be translated into something that is meaningful to them. And so your point is a good one, David. That we don't just nattering on about we've achieved X percentage of requirements coverage and Y percentage of risk coverage and Z percentage of code coverage, and assuming that is in any sense meaningful without further education of the stakeholders is a bad assumption. Gardner asks, I only see the contact screen. Is that right? Yes, during the Q&A session, unless somebody asks a question about a specific slide, I just have the contact information up for want of anything else. Let's see. Jeremy asks, are there certain types of tests or coverage metrics to be aware of when doing mobile app testing that may not apply to testing of desktop applications? Well, certainly I think the configuration coverage is very important when you're talking about mobile app testing, because you're going to likely be covering a lot of different, or supporting a lot of different configurations. And so, yeah, I think that is that's one that becomes particularly important, as well as the persona coverage, because you're going to have a very disparate set of users out there in with the mobile application, and you try to use it in different ways. Now, of course, the mobile UI tends to limit the ways that someone can interact with an application more than a browser-based UI or a PC-based UI, by UI I mean user interface. But still, people will have different ways of interacting with a mobile application. You want to make sure that you've tested them. Kenneth asks, is there a good tool to help with determining code coverage from test cases where you exercise the test cases and it determines what code has been exercise tested? Yeah, there are plenty of tools out there. Again, I will not make any specific tool recommendations without actual analysis of your situation, and yes, that would be a consulting engagement. But in general, again, sit down, look at your requirements for the tool, and then find tools that can do it. There are plenty of code coverage tools out there, so you should have no trouble if you do a thorough analysis and finding one that will do exactly what you need it to do. Richard says, by the way, I look forward to taking your tracks in San Diego. See you there. Yeah, good. Looking forward to seeing you there, Richard. I will be in San Diego at the STP conference in April, so do look forward to seeing all of you there. If you can attend, it'd be great. Michelle asks, could you use tasks from sprint planning stories to measure specification coverage? For example, 50% of the stories tasks have been tested. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, you should do that. You definitely want to make sure that you're measuring coverage against the user stories. And of course, somebody was asking earlier about, how do we know we tested enough? I mean, part of the process of determining the number of story points assigned to a story for development purposes should include how much testing we need to do. So hopefully you're part of that estimation process. So David's got a follow-on question. How can a test lead know that he or she is using good coverage metrics, good coverage measures? Well, part of it is there's an objective part and a subjective part. Okay, the objective part is if you look at post-release, the effectiveness and efficiency of your testing using metrics like defect detection effectiveness and cost per defect and so forth. If you're happy with your test results, then you must be doing something right with respect to coverage, right? You must be testing the right things, because otherwise you would be not meeting your objectives for testing. And I can't get into a complete explanation of deriving metrics for testing at this point, but basically you should have effectiveness and efficiency metrics associated with each one of your defined objectives. Now the subjective part is, you want to ask decision makers and stakeholders if they feel like they have a good understanding of what you're testing when you're reporting your results. Is testing activity in some sense transparent to them? Do they have visibility into what's going on? And if they say no, then clearly your your coverage metrics, code or otherwise, would probably not be at system level, probably requirements and risks and so forth. If people feel that they do not have a good sense of what you're testing, as they have an opaqueness, a lack of transparency about what's going on in testing prior to release, then it's a pretty good bet that you're not using good coverage metrics, and you should try to address the problem. The problem may actually be not so much the metrics, but the way in which you present them. Let's see. Michelle asks, if the system has varying permissions levels that allow for different user groups, for example, basic user, management, or advanced user, and super user, could those user groups be used for persona coverage? Do you have any examples of persona coverage metrics? Yes, that would be one of the dimensions there. I mean, the thing with persona coverage is interesting. It can have to do with permission levels. It can have to do with styles of interacting with computers. Some people are, say, more nervous, and some people are more deliberate in terms of how they interact with computers. So, you want to look at various ways of analyzing how somebody's going to interact, what permissions they're going to have, and so forth. This is kind of open-ended. It's not as crisp as say requirements coverage or risk coverage, and also it's partly just because people don't tend to do it as much, and so it's kind of an ill-understood art. I think it'd be interesting for somebody, maybe one of the few hundred people that are listening right now, to go off and do some experiments on effective persona coverage and testing based on personas, and come up with some good ideas here. Let's see. Griffin comments about testing being always a sampling problem. Yes. David's comment here, absolutely agree with the need to be humble with reporting. Part of that is also educating stakeholders about how to interpret and use the information that the testing groups provide. Yes, absolutely. I got a follow-on question from Richard here. When will this recorded session be available on your website? I'd like to use this for lunch and learn for my team. Thanks. Oh, probably about within a week. I'd say check back this time next week and see if it's there. It'll be on the digital library, and also you can find it on the RBCS YouTube channel. Diana asks, have you used mind maps to represent test coverage for applications? No, I have not tried that. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work, so you could give that a try. Doug asks, I work in an organization in which almost all programming is done in SAS. I've never found any whitebox coverage tools for SAS. Are you aware of any? No, I am not. I'm not sure how you would do that. The code coverage tools that I'm aware of are all for more, how to describe it, open languages in a sense. And SAS is just, in some sense, a closed language. You know, you'd have to contact SAS themselves and ask them, is it possible to do it, which I'm sure you have already done. Let's see, Griffin's got a good comment here. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. It's called Goodhart's Law. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Another comment from Griffin, fear over confidence. Yes, definitely. I have a comment from Erline. Thanks from Washington, D.C. You are welcome. Question from Marcella. What about the static quality control? For example, test strategies, quality plans, and test procedures. What kind of measurements can you obtain from these documents? Are these really necessary for testing projects? I think you're talking about static testing techniques like reviews and static analysis and so forth. I would not tend to mix the metrics from that. I mean, I think you could, in the long run, try to develop some sort of unified theory of test coverage across all the different levels of coverage. But I think this is a walk before you run kind of thing, in the sense of, you know, you need to make sure that you've got your coverage metrics all working properly for a single level of testing before you worry about how to integrate other levels of testing. There's a question about when is the next course and what is the subject, please. You will all, as attendees, be receiving an invite to the next webinar here shortly, and you can also always find them on our website and the homepage, rbcs-us.com. Let's see. I've got follow-up questions here about names of tools and so forth. Again, I do not want to get into specific names of tools because it's just not going to be helpful to you. If you do a web search for using the search string code coverage tool, if that's what you're looking for, you can do that. But again, starting with the tool is the wrong starting point. Please don't do that. Sit down and think about what you're trying to accomplish first. I've seen way too many things where people are basically trying to put screws into a wall with a hammer because they went out and did a Google search for hammer, rather than going, what is the right way to put a screw in the wall? Now, I realize that's an oversimplification, and I'm trying to drive this point home. I would not be doing anybody any services if I started rattling off names of tools, because what would happen is that somebody would listen to that list of tools, ignore what I said about start with your requirements, and go and start playing around with the tools. And that's just, I've Seen way too many sad stories that started off that way. Kajal says, thanks for a good session as always. Thanks, Rex. You're welcome. A comment here, I am on, but was not asked for my name or email address. How do you know that I am on? That's weird. I don't know how you got registered, Michael, without providing a name and email address. I'd be interested in getting an email from you. Send info at rbcs-us.com and let us know how that happened, and we will try to address that. Comment here from Griffin regarding all the asks for tools recommendations. Would a medical doctor behave that way? Your statements have been good. Thank you for validating that. Yes, I mean, I think the medical doctor thing is perfect. I mean, if somebody said, if somebody went to a medical doctor and said, I've got a pain somewhere in the center mass of my body, what do you think I should take for that? No doctor in his right mind, his or her right mind, would begin to rattle off lists of medications. So it's exactly that same thing. Thank you for that useful metaphor. Okay, well, we still have a few lagging questions, and I did let the pending questions, not lagging. I did let the webinar run a little long today because of the late start, for which I again apologize on Citrix's behalf. All of you attending will receive a discount code, by the way. It's our way of thanking you for putting up with the inconvenience associated with this. I do want to, at this point, close the session, and I'll just briefly remind you, check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up for the next webinars. We do special webinar presentations for companies, so you can send an email to info@rbcs-us.com to find out more about that. You can sign up for our newsletter at our website, which will get you discounts on consulting and training services, news about what we're up to, and an article. We're on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @RBCS. We're on Facebook. Our page is RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days, because you could be the lucky winner of our free e-learning course. As I said, you can check out the digital library. We've got recorded webinars out there, as videos out there. We are on iTunes. Just search for RBCS Podcast, and we got the RBCS channel on YouTube, so it's another resource. All these free resources are offered as a service to the software testing community, because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. This concludes the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today, and again, thank you very much for your patience with the extended problem at the beginning. Goodbye.